This video is about deep theory crafting analysis about Dendro Bloom teams for Neuvillette. Bloom teams have always been very strong in the meta, because they just allow you to brutally force your way through any kind of opponent as long as you have just the right amount of Dendro application sources on the team. Among the many Bloom variants, for Burgeon and Hyperbloom teams you can play a Hydro carry as the on-fielder instead of a unit like Nahida, replacing pitch-perfect Dendro application for nothing. Neuvillette barges into the scene with a much more offensive toolkit than the two units I just mentioned, so analyzing Bloom teams for him has been quite the threat for me. Starting from the hot topic I bet just about everybody is curious about, Neuvillette's application is not really noteworthy. Since he's able to apply Hydro just 3 times during his charge attacks, and just once for every burst and elemental skill he uses, he pales in comparison to Yelan and Xingqiu even when taken singularly, which is a mediocre result to say the least considering their off-field units. Even if you want to consider Xingqiu an anomaly in terms of mechanics, since when he came out, miHoYo was pretty much setting internal cooldown completely randomly on characters, Yelan is a much more recent release, so it's not an excuse for Neuvillette. Before we go further into the analysis, I want to remind you all that if you appreciate the effort I put into my theory crafting, you can show your support by subscribing and leaving a thumbs up. Moving on, his concerning lack of application is balanced out by a remarkable amount of road hydro damage. Neuvillette is no Ayato, and he will absolutely put both Xingqiu and Yelan to shame, even with a free-to-play option like Prototype Amber. In fact, he normally is a hyper carry with a capital H, and he doesn't even need particular buffs to do well, so on Bloom teams he will be able to deal huge amounts of damage as long as his Ascension 1 passive has the proper stack amount. But the real question is, how does he fit in actual teams? As I told you in the first video I made about his teams, his animation times can be quite slow, and as a result, his team rotation lengths can be quite worrisome. Fortunately, teams like Hyperbloom accommodate him quite well. Compared to somebody like Kazuha, the supportive units here don't need to spend as much time on field to activate their abilities. Characters like Raiden and Nahida only need to use their skill once, and that will really help you tighten the rotation even with a selfish carry like Neuvillette in play. In terms of team composition, one could think you have plenty of room to increase the Hydro application on the team through a second Hydro unit here, since Neuvillette isn't exactly bringing much, but the reality is that there is a limit to the Hydro load an off-field Nahida can sustain in terms of Bloom generation. For example, here is a Hyperbloom team with just Yelan's burst as Hydro application. Her burst coordinated attacks alone have rather similar application as the entirety of Neuvillette's application in terms of frequency and amount, so this comparison is possible. As you can see here, the Dendro application is pretty consistent even with just Nahida's elemental skill in play. Generally, as long as your Hydro application is only enough to generate around 10 blooms with 1 bloom per second or so, it will be fine. In comparison, here is the same team, but with Kokomi's Jellyfish Hydro application on top of it. While the bloom generation surely increases, Nahida's application consistency is taken to a limit here. Since she applies Dendro only once every couple seconds, 3 consecutive Hydro applications really put a huge dent on the Dendro aura consistency. So what's happening here is that you can't fully take advantage of all the additional Hydro application you get. You could theoretically swap back to Nahida in some situations to use the elemental skill again or a normal attack and reinforce the Dendro aura, but doing so is a rotation extension in some situations. So, in terms of actual team building, this leaves you room to fill the flex slot with someone that helps Neuvillette specifically, and a possible solution is Zhongli, unironically. Not only using Zhongli will help you maximize Neuvillette's Ascension 1 passive, but he also provides Hydro resistance reduction, which is pretty hard to get on this team otherwise. also is providing the best defensive utility you could wish for. In this rotation, Neuvillette spends about 14 seconds on field unprotected by iframes, so a shielder really comes in handy in this situation. Something noteworthy here is that the Hyperbloom count is low enough, and Neuvillette's personal damage is high enough that the latter is still pretty dominant in terms of damage contribution, so any kind of investment will benefit him greatly here. However, energy requirements can get pretty high on the team, so beware. An alternative to this Hyperbloom team is the Kokomi variant. Sure, the Dendro uptime won't be that consistent here, but you will still get additional Hyperblooms nonetheless. As a trade-off, lowering Neuvillette's reaction stack counts to 2 to add more Hyperblooms, Hydro Resonance, and lower his energy recharge requirements has pretty good results. And this is the Hyperbloom team that performs the best for him at a free-to-play level, since his damage contribution is lower in this scenario. In general, the team's DPS results are pretty similar to the Zhongli team I've shown you earlier, so it's basically at the same level at a glance. The third alternative is putting a cryo unit like Layla in the flex slot. Since cryo and Dendro aura can coexist on opponents, this allows you to simultaneously get blooms and freeze opponents when you apply Hydro on them. Furthermore, if the Hydro aura is strong enough when applied, that will also allow you to have an underlying Hydro on frozen opponents, which will allow you to get even more blooms if the Dendro application is present. However, in general, if the Hydro application is not dominant on the team, then the Cryo Aura can lower the amount of blooms you get by disrupting the Hydro on opponents a bit. So, I've been assuming one less Hyperbloom per rotation with Layla on the team, although I'm not sure this is entirely accurate in all scenarios. With this assumption, the team stacks up pretty well. This is the team where Neuvillette's raw damage contribution is the highest, since the Hyperbloom's share of damage here is lower compared to other teams. This is practically just a side grade to the Zhongli variant. However, overall, how do Neuvillette Hyperbloom teams stack up to the best Hyperbloom teams we have out there? Not too well. If you pick a cookie free-to-play Hyperbloom team and you put it against the free-to-play variant of the Neuvillette Kokomi Hyperbloom team, which I'll remind you all is the team that performed the best at a free-to-play level in my calculations, the difference is very noticeable. The harsh truth is that, while Yelan and Xinqiu can't compare to Neuvillette in terms of damage when taken singularly, they surely can when they're combined. And if on top of that you add all the extra Hyperblooms the team gets, since you can run Anahida on field, it becomes really hard to make a case against it. The only upside the Neuvillette comp will probably have compared to it is its AoE damage. Since Neuvillette can deal even more than 50% of the team damage in some compositions, his horizontal AoE can definitely be the difference maker in specific situations if compared to the Cookie Hyperbloom compositions, which are definitely more limited in terms of range. However, not all Bloom teams are Hyperbloom teams, so moving on, here is a Burgeon team analysis for Neuvillette. Bloom teams have usually benefited from Thoma in the past as their primary Bloom arsonist, but the issue here is that his burst to launch coordinated attacks requires your active character to use normal attacks, something Neuvillette won't be able to do consistently. So here enters Dehya, the infamous Pyro standard character. Not only Dehya isn't limited to specific types of attacks to unleash your elemental skill procs, but she also provides some kind of protection through it. I'm considering two scenarios for this team, one where the team doesn't get a Vaporites procs, which will be a single target scenarios, and one where you manage to get a random Vaporites off in a AoE scenario. This makes Neuvillette's personal damage vary since Vaporites activates a stack of his passive. Honestly, this composition doesn't perform too badly compared to the vast majority of Burgeon teams I've seen calculation-wise. And if you can get the third stack from Neuvillette's passive, I'd even call it pretty damn decent. It's only a bit worse at full potential than the Hyperbloom teams I've analyzed before, because even with Dehya's lackluster pyro frequency, since Neuvillette can't create that many blooms, she's not at a huge disadvantage compared to Hyperbloom comps, so it's fine. Lastly, here is a brief outlook at Nilou bloom teams for Neuvillette. Honestly, I really didn't feel like calculating the team's damage output here, because it's a team whose damage scales up in unpredictable ways in AoE scenarios, but I still analyzed the composition enough to make some considerations. First, Neuvillette only gets one passive stack activation here, which limits his output by a lot. Since his raw damage is the primary reason you'd even consider him for Bloom teams in the first place, this is pretty significant. Second, on this team his slow animation can really be felt, as he pushes the team rotation length to 25 seconds. Options like Kokomi or Yelan are more flexible in general. Basically, he really doesn't seem like a significant upgrade to the team to me in this situation, but maybe practical scenarios will tell otherwise. Who knows? This took quite the effort, but finally I'm done for today. My analysis of Neuvillette and Grizzly's teams is not over yet by any means, so if you enjoyed this video, stay tuned for more.